Thanks, Bob. All right, Evan, I see that the same old UFO stories are making another round. What is happening?
Well, I think we can credit 60 Minutes for the latest revival in the old UFO stories being dusted off. Now, can I assume that the majority of our audience knows what 60 Minutes is? You think that's fair?
An hour?
You know,
it's a new show.
Kind of the show itself, yes, called 60 Minutes, mainstay of CBS, you know, the Columbia broadcast system here in America. Since 1968, Jay, it's as old as you are.
Right.
And a year older than me. And there's lots of versions and variations of 60 Minutes around the world. And of course, you can get the American version around the world. So I think we can safely assume that most people know when I say 60 Minutes what we're talking about. So 60 Minutes has been referred to as one of the most esteemed news magazines on American television. That's straight out of the New York Times. Those are their words. And 60 Minutes has had, and still in relative terms has a massive audience.
How massive?
So I looked it up in the late 70s and early 1980s. It was drawing a 28 average share for ratings. And what that means, I mean, that is huge.
Yeah,
it was the third largest show in all of television. No other news show even hit the top 30. So it was all alone as far as this goes. And today it still has a 10 average rating.
Yeah, I knew it was got to be a lot lower.
And when you have a bazillion options like you do now, that's still, for what it is, a very impressive number. The show has pull. The show has influence. No doubt about it. So when a show of that prominence does a story on UFOs, or we can use the more modern cognomen UAPs, which are unidentified aerial phenomena, then you know a good chunk of the country and perhaps the world is going to stop and take notice of this. And that's what we got this past Sunday in this highly talked about 60 Minutes segment titled UAP. And it was presented by Bill Whitaker. And here's what they presented in the span of 13 minutes. I'm going to try to sum it up in 3 minutes or less. I'm going to give it my best shot. All right. Here's how they open up the segment. They say, "We've tackled many strange stories on 60 Minutes, but perhaps none like this. It's the story of the U.S. government's grudging acknowledgement of unidentified aerial phenomena. After decades of public denial, the Pentagon now admits there's something out there, and the U.S. Senate wants to know what it is. The Senate Intelligence Committee has ordered the Director of National Intelligence and the Secretary of Defense to deliver a report on the mysterious sightings by next month," meaning June. That's the opening monologue, okay? So they jump into it right away by interviewing Luis Elizondo. Now that name sounds familiar. Oh, because it is familiar. In fact, it's very familiar. I know that I've talked about Luis Elizondo several times over the course of the last few years, especially when we've been talking about UFOs and UAPs. Let me sum up for you who he is. He's a former U.S. military intelligence official, and he ran the Department of Defense's now defunct Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, or ATIP. And he ran it from 2007. Well, he was involved with it from 2007. He took over command of it in 2010, and he was part of it to its end in 2012. So he was part of it for 5 years. And you and I and every other taxpayer in America paid the way for it. $22 million for this program before it got mothballed. And it ran for 5 full years, but you didn't know about it because it was classified. And we only learned about this in 2017. And that's when we first talked about it on the Skeptics Guide. So here are some things that he said in the 60 Minutes interview. The U.S. government has already stated for the record that UFOs or UAPs are real. I'm not telling you that. The United States government is telling you that. He goes on. He says, "Imagine a technology that can do 600 to 700 G-forces, that can fly at 13,000 miles an hour, that can evade radar, and that can fly through the air and water and possibly space. Oh, and by the way, has no obvious signs of propulsion, no wings, no control surfaces, and yet still can defy the natural effects of Earth's gravity." That's precisely what we're seeing.
That's right.
Yep.
You better believe it.
Now, Luis Elizondo. All right. Hang on. Let me back up again about the $22 million and when he was in charge of it. You know where much of that money went that Elizondo doled out as part of that department? It went to Robert Bigelow's aerospace company. Robert Bigelow. Bigelow's company hired the researchers who did the investigations as part of this project. Now, Robert Bigelow, that's another name familiar to SGU listeners. He was once interviewed on CBS's 60 Minutes, and he said he was absolutely convinced that aliens, I mean, we're talking extraterrestrial aliens exist and that UFOs have definitely visited the Earth. And it's not just that. I've talked about him in the context of Skinwalker Ranch. Do you guys remember this?
Yeah.
Yes, I do.
A haunted ranch in Utah, described by true believers as a hyperdimensional portal area, or Stargate, as we like to think of it. And the ranch is said to be infested by an alien or paranormal shape-shifting creature known as a skinwalker. Mm-hmm. And it takes on the context of kind of what the werewolves are in more European legends. So 60 Minutes, of course, doesn't go into that kind of detail, but that's all right. I'm helping 60 Minutes out here. I'm filling the gaps. I'm just putting it in context so that you know who Luis Elizondo is and the kind of company and things, company he keeps and ideas that he keeps.
Because you wouldn't know that from watching the 60 Minutes.
No, you would not. Not one bit. So this is the credibility of the first person that they interview, okay? So you have a true believer with military intelligence resources and $22 million that he doled out to other true believers. Surprise, surprise. What do you get as a result of all that intelligence and research? Technology that defies all of the laws of physics, if not many of them. So then they shift. They jump into interviewing some of the Navy pilots whose video footage is going to be part of this report to the Senate. And they are finally declassified to the point where they can now come out and talk about them. Now, one fellow's name,
because when they come out of the darkness, it's never bullshit.
No, of course, never, ever. Although they tend to be a little bit, I think, more practical than perhaps some of the other people that come up as part of the 60-minute segment. So one fellow's name is Ryan Graves, and he was part of an FA-18F squadron, and he was part of the group that saw the Virginia Beach UAP phenomenon in 2014. And his squadron was also part of the sighting in Jacksonville, Florida, 2015. These are the video footage from the U.S. Navy planes that were captured of these objects, apparently, flying around doing incredible things that when you watch it on video, it's pretty remarkable. It looks pretty impressive. How could they be possibly? They're tracking. They've got it locked on and they're tracking something that is flying at what seems like a totally unreasonable speed over the ocean. So small, so hard to detect it. And then it starts shifting and going in 90 degrees in this way. No way it could possibly really be doing this as far as the laws of physics are concerned. So they go into also speaking to another person, Christopher Mellon. He served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence for Presidents Clinton and George Bush. He had access to the secret government programs, and he's a defender of Elizondo and the entire program. And then they finish up by talking to Marco Rubio, who is on the Intelligence Committee for the Senate, and they get some quotes from him. And that's basically it. Maybe that wasn't 3 minutes, but I did my best. So that's what 60 Minutes packaged for their worldwide audience to watch. I have a question for 60 Minutes. Where was the skeptical representation in any of this? None. If they had contacted any one of the numerous skeptical organizations out there, they would have had no trouble whatsoever finding people to come on and offer some rather prosaic explanations for what was going on. Let me give you an example. Mick West, that's a name I think our audience is very familiar with. Mick West has been on a lot of different skeptical shows. He's given talks at SciCon, and he's been out there for 10 years specifically talking about this phenomenon and these particular sets of video footage that are captured by these Department of Defense Navy planes.
He's a good man, and not just because he has our book on his bookshelf.
That's
completely incidental to my opinion.
No, completely incidental that our book holds a space on his bookshelf when he's giving interviews from his office. Thank you, Mick. So, full disclosure, right? So he's become, I think, the go-to person in the skeptic community for this type of video analysis. His analysis is pretty easy to understand. It makes the fewest new or unknown assumptions, and it requires zero appeals to things like breaking the laws of physics. He basically boils it down to this. You just have to you get the basic data, okay? Who shot it? Where it was shot? What time of day or night was it? What direction was the camera facing? What was the hardware itself? What kind of lens were they using? What was the exposure? What other metadata can you get from the information? Try to also get the original source video. By the time you see some of these things on the internet, it's gone through pixelation and manipulation and other things. So try to get the original source video. And then what you do is you take that and then you recreate the conditions in which it happened. If it was the night sky, you'd use the star positions. You can figure out where you were and what the positions of the stars were at night, and the positions of the planets, such as Venus, which we know often comes up as getting in the way of otherwise analysis of certain things that you're seeing in the night sky. And then you can utilize online flight data websites. For example, there's one called Flight Radar 24, and you can track a plane or the history of the flight of a plane, and you can get it back to a very specific date and time and position. And when you do that, when you put all those pieces of the puzzle together, lo and behold, you can figure out that, okay, this camera in this position at this time of day, this plane was here. Delta Flight 400 out of Los Angeles, for example, was, hey, look, right exactly along that flight path, and perhaps at that time was right there. So he's able to put it together. And he basically kind of did this of his own initiative. And over the years, he's been able to analyze the footage this way and come up with, frankly, a lot of straightforward answers as to what it was these pilots and other things that have been captured, what they were seeing. And in most cases, it's other aircraft that for whatever reason, the pilots themselves, or they can't determine when the Department of Defense looks at these things exactly what they're looking at. Mick was able to kind of put it together. But there are also other things. There's birds, there's glare, other objects, balloons he talks about. And he also talks about how the hardware also works, especially on some of these cameras. There's all sorts of artifacts that occur. All of this stuff is known to us in the skeptical community. We talk about this. We've been talking about it for decades now. This does not come as a surprise to us. But you put it on a 60 Minutes program and they present it to the world like this is some sort of blockbuster, something so special that the strangest thing we've ever reported on in our 50 years of being one of the top news shows in the history of broadcasting. It kind of takes on a different life and a different set of importance that perhaps other people will then say, hey, there's really something going on here. But had they been paying attention or had they consulted the skeptical community sooner, I think they would have realized this is not news. New news, at least. It is old news, and it's already been explained.
Yeah, shame on 60 Minutes. Seriously, they should be absolutely ashamed of themselves. I know that, it's easy to be cynical and say they don't care, about their journalistic integrity. But I think this is just an absolute journalistic failure. They didn't give us sufficient information. They didn't tell the actual story. They didn't tell the actual story about what's going on here. And the information was available to them. They really have no excuse. They just didn't want to. They told the story they wanted to tell.
There you go.
Yeah, it's terrible.
Yeah, it's really frustrating. I looked around hard for some good treatments of this most recent version of this news item, trying to find some real good skeptical or scientific treatments, and I haven't seen any yet, and so that was kind of frustrating and disappointing. But for me, a lot of this goes back to, I'll even give one of Luis Elizondo's quotes. He said, "Sometimes there are simple explanations for the objects, but sometimes there aren't." Well, the thing is, though, that sometimes there's just not enough information. And you can't then, therefore, it's so blurry, and we've ruled out this, and this, and then therefore they make the leap. Oh, it's got to be, some sort of super advanced technology from another country or alien technology. Like, no, sometimes you just have to like accept the the ignorance, the lack of information, and you say, we're probably never going to know what this is because there simply isn't enough information. You can't even really throw out this idea that maybe some other country has technology that's like a century beyond what we have, or if not a century, then at least a few, like 3 or 4 generations beyond, beyond what we have, which is ridiculous because we would know about it. We would know about it, and you can't hide something like that.
Yeah, that's the thing. Again, for skeptics, this is such old news because it's like, at the end of the day, it's a dot. It's a blob. It's a blur. It's not information. and you're making an argument from ignorance, and they completely underestimate the potential for misidentification in terms of everything: size, speed, angle. It's so easy. And a lot of these times when they are figured out, it's like, oh, that was a bird. Oh, really? So you were all exercised about the amazing aerodynamic, characteristics of what turned out to be a bird. So that means that everything else you say is complete and utter horseshit. It's worthless. It's nothing. You don't have any reliable information. We're exactly where we were in 1960. It's 60 years later, and we have the same level of evidence. There's a reason why we have only blurry photos, because in focus photos are not spacecraft. They're nothing interesting, right? When it's in focus, it's a plane or a bird. But when it's out of focus,
or a bug.
Or a bug. When it's out of focus, you can imagine anything you want. But we're not getting, again, with all the new technology, with ubiquitous phones, whatever, we have nothing. The simplest explanation is there isn't anything. And keep in mind, nobody would love more than the four of us if we did have compelling evidence of actual alien spacecraft or whatever. It would be fascinating. We would be all over that.
God.
We would be all over it. All over it, yeah. It's the reason why we're not convinced by it is because the evidence is not convincing.
Right. And
that's the bottom line.
Right. And if you keep thinking about, but it was going at Mach 1 billion or whatever it was. Listen, this is how you think about that, because it's all about the assumptions you make. If you're assuming that this is a big thing that's far away, then yes, it would have to be traveling at 20, 30, 40 Mach. But if it's a very small thing that's closer to the camera than you ever imagined, then it's a normal thing that's traveling at normal speeds.
Yeah.
It's when you make that leap between, when you don't have enough information, that's when you get these claims of super physics and super tech that we can't explain.
It's just shit reporting. That's what it boils down.
It's terrible.
There's no other way to look at it, and in my opinion, it's the reason why we're talking about it right now is because it's our job to call these people out.
It's just click porn.
And what is the real outcome of this? Like they're never going to feel the heat. They're never going to care. Company that big, news outlet that big.
People are talking about it, Jay. It got ratings, and people days afterwards are continuing to comment about it. They got out of it exactly what they wanted.
Exactly, and they'll whatever publish a correction somewhere or something. Whatever. Maybe,
probably
but
not.
They've already accomplished what they wanted to accomplish.
That's right. Remember the old Woody Woodpecker cartoon? If Woody had gone right to the police, this would have never happened. Well, if 60 Minutes went right to the skeptical community, this report may not have ever happened. And therefore, one must wonder if, they kind of deliberately didn't go to seek an opposite opinion here.
Yeah, you have to wonder if, at the executive level, it's like, do we want to get this story right, or do we have enough plausible deniability here where we could put this story out?
Right, and raise our advertising
Who cares if it's right or wrong? We can defend putting it out. That's what really matters. Not is it right, is it defensible? And but again, that's just horrible journalism. Horrible. All right. Not that we care about things like this, though, right? No, this definitely gets our skeptical hackles up.
Oh, yeah.
All right, Jay. We need a palate cleanser. So it is Who's That Noisy time.
All right, guys. Last week I played This Noisy.